On May 6, 1945, General George Patton stood in the Czechoslovak city of Pilsen and watched his soldiers being showered with flowers. Tens of thousands of Czechs lined the streets, waving American flags they had hidden for 6 years under Nazi occupation. Children climbed onto Sherman tanks, women kissed soldiers, old men wept openly, grasping the hands of young Americans who could not understand their words, but understood their gratitude. The celebration was delirious, genuine, and heartbreaking, because 50 miles to the east, in Prague, people were dying while waiting for Americans who would never come. That same morning, Czech radio operators were broadcasting desperate appeals in English. Here is Prague. Here is Prague. Americans and English, help us. They knew American soldiers could hear them. They knew Patton's army was close enough to reach Prague in hours. What they did not know was that a decision had already been made in the highest levels of Allied command. Eisenhower had drawn a line on a map, and Prague fell on the wrong side of it. Patton wanted to keep going. He had the men. He had the tanks. He had momentum. His Third Army numbered over 540,000 soldiers, probably one of the most powerful armies ever assembled in the history of war, according to his own Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay. The road to Prague lay open. German resistance had collapsed. Enemy soldiers were surrendering by the thousands, desperate to become American prisoners rather than fall into Soviet hands. But Patton received a phone call that stopped him cold. General Omar Bradley was on the line, and his message was blunt. "You hear me, George? God damn it, halt!" The Supreme Allied Commander had given orders. American forces would advance no further than the line running through Karlovy Vary, Pilsen, and České Budějovice. Prague belonged to the Soviets. Eisenhower believed he was preventing unnecessary complications with Stalin. He was actually sealing the fate of Czechoslovakia for the next 44 years. The story of why American tanks sat idle while Prague burned reveals something profound about how history turns on decisions made by men who cannot see the full consequences of their choices. It is a story about the gap between military thinking and political reality, about the cost of prioritizing alliance management over human freedom, and about how the boundaries of Cold War Europe were drawn in those final chaotic days of the Second World War. Winston Churchill understood. Patton understood. The Czech radio operators broadcasting into the void understood. Only Eisenhower, focused on military objectives and inter-allied coordination, failed to grasp what was truly at stake. To understand why American forces halted at Pilsen, we must first understand what Czechoslovakia meant in the spring of 1945, and why its people had every reason to expect American liberation. Czechoslovakia had been Hitler's first major conquest, through intimidation rather than invasion. In September 1938, the Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border regions of Czechoslovakia, to Nazi Germany without a single shot being fired. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper and promising peace for our time. French Premier Édouard Daladier knew better. When crowds cheered him at the Paris airport, he did not share their optimism. According to some accounts, he muttered words of dismay at the celebrating crowd, though the exact phrasing remains disputed by historians. What is certain is that Daladier understood Munich was no victory. The Czechs had been betrayed by their supposed allies. Their country had been dismembered to appease a dictator who had no intention of being appeased. 6 months later, in March 1939, German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The independent nation ceased to exist. What remained became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, a puppet state ruled by German overseers with absolute power. For 6 years, Czechoslovakia endured Nazi occupation. The Germans exploited Czech industry, particularly the famous Skoda works, to fuel their war machine. They suppressed Czech culture, closed universities after anti-Nazi student demonstrations in November 1939, and executed intellectuals. 9 students and professors were killed, and over 1,200 were sent to concentration camps. After the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, the Reich protector, by Czech resistance fighters in June 1942, the Nazis responded with systematic terror. They wiped the village of Lidis off the map on June 10th, murdering every adult male and deporting women and children to concentration camps. The village of Lezaki suffered a similar fate. The message was unmistakable. Resistance meant death. But by the spring of 1945, everything had changed. The Red Army was advancing from the east, having pushed through Poland and into Germany itself. American and British forces were driving from the west, having crossed the Rhine in March and penetrated deep into the German heartland. The Nazi regime was crumbling. Hitler was confined to his bunker in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. And in Prague, the resistance began preparing for an uprising that would restore Czech honor and secure Czech freedom. The Czech National Council had been coordinating with resistance networks throughout the country. They monitored Allied broadcasts. They tracked the movements of German forces. They stockpiled what weapons they could find, mostly small arms captured from deserters or acquired through underground channels. They knew their moment was coming. What they did not fully understand was that their fate had already been discussed at the highest levels of Allied diplomacy, in meetings where no Czech representative was present and Czech interests were barely considered. At Yalta in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had gathered to plan the post-war world. The Big Three spent most of their time on Poland, arguing over boundaries and governments. They discussed German occupation zones. They negotiated Soviet entry into the Pacific War. Czechoslovakia was barely mentioned. No explicit agreement placed it in the Soviet sphere of influence. No line on any map assigned Prague to Stalin. The conference took place at the Livadia Palace in Crimea, a region the Soviets had recently liberated from German occupation. Roosevelt was visibly ill, his health failing after 12 years in the presidency and the immense strain of leading America through depression and war. He would be dead within 2 months. Churchill was politically weakened, facing an election he would lose that summer. Stalin alone was at the height of his power, his armies occupying half of Europe, his position unassailable. The Western leaders wanted Soviet help against Japan. They wanted Soviet cooperation in the United Nations. They wanted to avoid a breakdown in the alliance that had defeated Hitler. They were prepared to make concessions to achieve these goals. Eastern Europe was the price. But the implications of Yalta were clear to those who could read between the lines. Stalin intended to dominate Eastern Europe. The Red Army occupied territory, and occupation created facts on the ground. The Western Allies were not prepared to fight another war to prevent Soviet expansion. They had agreed, implicitly if not explicitly, that Eastern Europe would fall within Moscow's orbit. The Declaration on Liberated Europe, signed at Yalta, promised free elections in all territories freed from Nazi control. It was a hollow promise. Stalin had no intention of allowing genuinely free elections in countries his armies occupied. Within 3 years, every nation in Eastern Europe would be under communist control, their elections rigged, their democracies destroyed. President Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, just weeks before the crisis in Prague. Harry Truman inherited the presidency with almost no preparation for the challenges he would face. Roosevelt had kept Truman at arm's length. sharing little about the secret agreements and diplomatic understandings that governed Allied relations. Truman did not even know about the atomic bomb until after he became president. The new president was dependent on advisors who emphasized one point above all others. Soviet cooperation was essential for ending the war against Japan. The atomic bomb had not yet been tested. American military planners assumed that invading Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. Soviet entry into the Pacific War, promised at Yalta, could save those lives by forcing Japan to fight on two fronts. Against this calculation, what was Czechoslovakia? What was Prague? These were European problems, and Europe was secondary to the Pacific. If maintaining Soviet cooperation meant letting Stalin have his way in Eastern Europe, that was a price American leaders were prepared to pay. This was the context when Patton's tanks crossed into Czechoslovakia on April 18, 1945. The American advance into Bohemia began when elements of the 90th Infantry Division crossed the border near Cheb. The reconnaissance task force of the 358th Infantry Regiment, specifically elements from its 3rd Battalion, had the honor of being the first American unit on Czechoslovak soil. They moved quickly through terrain that had seen little fighting, advancing along roads lined with white flags hung from German homes. The speed of the advance surprised even American commanders. German units were collapsing faster than intelligence had predicted. The Wehrmacht soldiers who had terrorized Europe for 6 years now wanted only to survive. They threw away their weapons, shed their uniforms, and tried to blend into the civilian population. Those who could not escape surrendered in droves. By the end of April, American forces had established a front running roughly north to south through western Bohemia. The city of Karlovy Vary, famous for its spas, fell without significant resistance. Marienbad and its elegant hotels became American headquarters. Every day brought new advances, new liberated towns, new celebrations. Patton's 5th Corps and 12th Corps led the advance into Czechoslovakia. These were veteran formations that had fought across France and Germany. They knew how to move fast and hit hard. Their equipment was abundant, their supply lines secure, their morale high. They sensed the war was ending and they wanted to finish it with one final push. The 16th Armoured Division, commanded by Brigadier General John Leonard Pierce, spearheaded the advance toward Pilsen. The division had been activated only in 1943 and had arrived in Europe just months before the war's end, but its soldiers were eager to prove themselves. They drove their Sherman tanks through the Bohemian countryside, past farms where peasants waved and cheered, past towns where Czech flags appeared, as if by magic on every building. The tank battalions were organized according to standard army doctrine, with approximately 170 medium Sherman tanks and over 70 light Stuart tanks across the division's armoured battalions. The Shermans were not the equal of German Panthers or Tigers in one-on-one combat, but by May 1945 there were few German tanks left to fight. The war had devoured Germany's armour. What remained was scattered, low on fuel, and manned by crews who knew the end was near. The reception was unlike anything the soldiers had experienced. Czechs lined the roads, cheering, waving flags, throwing flowers onto American vehicles. After 6 years of occupation, 6 years of fear and humiliation, they were free. The Americans represented not just military victory, but the values that Czechs had believed in since Thomas Masaryk founded their republic in 1918. Democracy, freedom, the rule of law. The Americans embodied everything the Nazis had tried to destroy. The contrast with Soviet liberation was stark and troubling. When the Red Army advanced, it brought liberation from Nazi occupation, but it also brought new forms of suffering. Soviet soldiers looted civilian property systematically. They assaulted women in numbers that shocked even battle-hardened observers. They shipped German civilians eastward for forced labor. The behavior was not universal, but it was common enough that civilian populations throughout Eastern Europe fled westward, desperate to reach American or British lines before the Soviets arrived. German soldiers felt the same desperation. They knew what awaited them in Soviet captivity. The death rate among German prisoners in Soviet hands exceeded 30%. Those who survived faced years of forced labor in Siberian camps. Surrendering to Americans, by contrast, meant decent treatment and eventual release. German units throughout Bohemia raced westward, hoping to reach American lines before the Red Army caught them. The 11th Panzer Division, one of the strongest German units in the region, surrendered to the American 90th Infantry Division on May 4th. Its commander, General Rend von Wietersheim, knew what awaited his men in Soviet hands. He chose to surrender to Americans near the village of Visruby, ending any organized German resistance in western Bohemia. The mass surrenders created logistical challenges that American commanders had not anticipated. Prisoner of war cages overflowed. German soldiers lined roads waiting to be processed. Some units simply laid down their weapons and walked toward American lines, hoping to be accepted. The desperation was palpable. These men had fought across Europe for 6 years. Now they wanted only to survive, and survival meant American captivity. The speed of the German collapse meant that Patton's forces faced almost no opposition on the road to Prague. Intelligence reports indicated that the Wehrmacht units between Pilsen and the Czech capital were disintegrating. Staff officers calculated that American armor could reach Prague within 6 to 8 hours of receiving the order to advance. The tanks were fueled. The ammunition was loaded. The men were ready. Patton understood the military opportunity. His Third Army was positioned to take Prague with minimal resistance. The German forces between his lines and the Czech capital were either surrendering or fleeing eastward toward the Soviet advance. Reconnaissance elements from the 4th Armoured Division had already pushed close to Prague's outskirts before being ordered to pull back. The road was open. The resistance was minimal. Prague could be taken within hours. On May 4th, encouraged by Winston Churchill, Eisenhower notified the Soviet High Command that American forces might advance further into Czechoslovakia. He proposed pushing to the Vltava River, which runs through Prague, and the Elbe River to the north. Churchill had cabled President Truman directly, arguing in the strongest terms that the liberation of Prague by Patton's Third Army might make the whole difference to the post-war situation in Czechoslovakia. Churchill understood what Eisenhower did not. Whoever liberated a country would shape its political future. The populations of liberated nations felt gratitude toward their liberators. The armies that arrived first established facts on the ground. If Americans liberated Prague, Czechoslovakia would look westward. If the Soviets liberated Prague, Czechoslovakia would be drawn into Moscow's orbit. But Eisenhower made a critical error. Instead of announcing that American forces would advance to Prague, he asked the Soviets for permission. Czech historian Vít Smetana identified this as the decisive moment. Eisenhower decided to ask about the possibility of Americans pushing forward instead of simply announcing that was going to happen. The Soviet response came on May 5th from General Alexei Antonov, chief of the Soviet General Staff. Antonov's message was polite but firm. To avoid possible incidents, he asked Eisenhower not to move east of the agreed demarcation line running through Karlovy Vary, Pilsen, and České Budějovice. He reminded Eisenhower that Soviet forces had stopped at Wismar at American request during the advance into northern Germany. He claimed that the Prague operation of the Red Army had already started. This was a lie. Soviet troops were only beginning to take up positions around Dresden on May 5th. The actual Prague offensive did not commence until May 6th. Antonov was misleading Eisenhower, buying time for Soviet forces to reach Prague first. The city that Americans could have liberated in hours would take the Soviets 4 more days to reach. Eisenhower accepted Antonov's request without challenge. He ordered American forces to halt at the demarcation line. His reasoning was purely military. He believed his directive called only for the defeat of Germany's armed forces, not for achieving political objectives. He wanted to avoid friendly fire incidents with Soviet forces advancing from the opposite direction. He did not consider himself authorized to make political decisions about post-war boundaries without explicit instructions from civilian leadership. This reasoning was technically defensible and strategically catastrophic. While Eisenhower and Antonov exchanged diplomatic messages, Prague was exploding in violence. The uprising began on May 5th, 1945. At 6 in the morning, Czech radio announcer Zdeněk Mankel began broadcasting in a mix of Czech and German, deliberately signaling defiance after 6 years of occupation. The signal went out across Bohemia. Czechs who had been waiting for years understood immediately. The resistance was rising. Throughout the morning, the situation escalated. Czech police officers, who had maintained an uneasy relationship with the German occupation authorities, began to act. They tore German signs from buildings. They raised Czech flags. They distributed weapons from hidden caches throughout the city. The atmosphere was electric with hope and fear. By 12:33 in the afternoon, the call to arms had gone out explicitly. Czech police and resistance fighters had stormed the radio station on Vinohradska Street, overwhelming the German guards after fierce fighting that left several dead on both sides. The broadcast that followed electrified Prague and changed history, calling all Czechs, "Come to our help at once. Come and defend Czech radio. The SS are murdering Czech people here." The Germans responded with immediate and overwhelming force. SS units that had been stationed throughout Prague converged on the radio station. They brought armoured vehicles and heavy weapons. The battle for Czech radio became the symbolic heart of the uprising, a fight for the voice of a nation that had been silenced for 6 years. The response from ordinary Czechs was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, approximately 30,000 Prague residents had taken up arms. They were students and factory workers, shopkeepers and civil servants, old men who remembered the independence of 1918 and young men who had known nothing but occupation. They built barricades across streets, approximately 1,600 of them by the first night and over 2,000 by the uprising's end. They attacked German positions with whatever weapons they could find, hunting rifles, pistols, hand grenades captured from surrendering soldiers, and raw courage born of 6 years of humiliation. Against them stood formidable German forces. 40,000 combat troops were stationed inside Prague itself, with another 50,000 or more on the outskirts. The Germans had tanks, artillery, armoured vehicles, and Luftwaffe aircraft that could strafe the barricades with impunity. They also had orders from Reich Minister Karl Hermann Frank, who had warned on the radio that any resistance would be drowned in a sea of blood. The Germans made good on the threat with systematic brutality. SS troops attacked the barricades with overwhelming firepower. They used incendiary bombs to burn out resistance positions. They positioned Czech civilians as human shields when advancing against defended positions. At Masaryk railway station on May 8th, they captured the building and executed approximately 50 resistance fighters and civilians who had defended it. The bodies were left where they fell as a warning to others. The fighting was savage, street by street, building by building. Czechs who had never held a weapon learned to fight in hours. they learned to die just as quickly. The Germans had training, equipment, and experience. The Czechs had numbers, desperation, and the knowledge that this was their only chance. The barricades were constructed from anything available: overturned trams, cobblestones torn from streets, furniture dragged from apartments, sandbags filled with rubble. The insurgents learned quickly that German tanks could not easily navigate streets blocked by debris, and that infantry advancing without armoured support was vulnerable to fire from upper-floor windows. The tactics were improvised, but they worked well enough to slow the German counterattacks. General Karel Kuttelwasser directed military operations for the uprising through what was called the Bartos Command, a parallel organization under General František Slunečko, known as the Alex Command, coordinated operations in the suburbs. Kuttelwasser was a veteran of the Czechoslovak Legion that had fought across Siberia during the Russian Civil War, a man who understood what it meant to fight against overwhelming odds. His wife later recalled that he had come home on May 3rd and told her with great solemnity that he had been entrusted with military command if Prague needed defence. Now Prague needed defence more desperately than anyone had anticipated. The insurgents were outgunned, and they knew it. They needed help. They needed the Americans who were sitting in Pilsen, just 50 miles away, close enough to reach Prague in a matter of hours. On May 6th, Czech radio operators began broadcasting appeals in English, knowing that American forces could hear them. The frequency was 415.5 meters, what they called the wave of freedom. The broadcasts were desperate, repeated, anguished. Here is Prague. Here is Prague. Americans and English, help us. We need guns. There are too many Germans. Send us aeroplanes and tanks. Americans before Pilsen, send us aeroplanes too. The Germans are coming from south, north, west, and east. Help us, help us. A Scottish prisoner of war named William Greig, a private in the Gordon Highlanders who had been captured at Saint-Valery-en-Caux in June 1940 and later escaped from a German labour camp, joined the uprising and broadcast his own appeal in English. Prague is in great danger. The Germans are attacking with tanks and planes. We are calling urgently our allies to help. Send immediately tanks and aircraft. Greig's mother, listening to BBC broadcasts in Aberdeen, recognized her son's voice. He would survive the uprising and receive the Czechoslovak Military Cross for his bravery in 1947. American soldiers at Patton's headquarters in Pilsen heard every word of these broadcasts. They understood what was happening. They knew their comrades were dying 50 miles away. They could not respond. Orders were orders. The line had been drawn. What happened next was one of the strangest episodes of the entire war, an intervention by soldiers who should have been enemies of everyone but who chose, at the last moment, to fight for the city that was calling for help. The Russian Liberation Army under General Andrei Vlasov was composed of Soviet prisoners of war and defectors who had agreed to fight for Nazi Germany against Stalin. Vlasov himself had been a Red Army hero who helped defend Moscow in 1941. Captured in 1942, he agreed to lead anti-Soviet forces, motivated by hatred of Stalin's regime and perhaps by simple survival. His Russian Liberation Army existed largely on paper for years, a propaganda tool rather than a fighting force. But by late 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated, the Nazis finally allowed formation of actual combat units. The 1st Division of the Russian Liberation Army, commanded by General Sergei Bunyachenko, numbered approximately 20,000 men. They were equipped with German weapons and organized along German lines. They were also despised by their German allies and hated by the Soviets, who considered them traitors deserving death. On May 4th, Czech resistance leaders contacted Bunyachenko near Prague. They appealed to him as a fellow Slav, asking for help against the German forces that were crushing the uprising. The request put Vlasov in an impossible position. He knew that fighting Germans would not earn forgiveness from Stalin. The Soviet dictator had already condemned every member of the Russian Liberation Army to death as traitors. Vlasov hoped to reach American lines and surrender, perhaps negotiating asylum in exchange for intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. But Bunyachenko and his officers saw the situation differently. They were Russians who had been forced to choose between dying in German prison camps and fighting for Nazi Germany. Now they had a chance to fight for something else. Prague was calling for help. The Czechs were fellow Slavs. This was an opportunity for redemption, or at least for dying in a cause worth dying for. Vlasov opposed intervention. His officers overruled him. On May 6th and 7th, approximately 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers of the Russian Liberation Army entered Prague. They brought what the Czech insurgents desperately lacked: tanks, artillery, military experience and training. The Russian Liberation Army soldiers knew how to fight. They had been fighting for years, first for the Red Army, then for Germany, now for themselves, and for Prague. They attacked German positions with professional efficiency. They captured the airport. They seized and held the radio station. They repelled German armoured counterattacks that would have overwhelmed the lightly armed Czech fighters. When German tanks advanced against barricades defended only by civilians with small arms, Russian Liberation Army soldiers with anti-tank weapons stopped them. General Bunyachenko reported approximately 300 of his men killed or wounded in the fighting. Many of them are buried in a mass grave in Prague's Olszany cemetery, their sacrifice unacknowledged for decades, their graves unmarked during the communist era, but redemption was denied them. When Russian Liberation Army commanders learned that Americans would not advance to Prague, they understood their fate. Communist Czech partisans were already arresting their soldiers to hand over to Soviet forces. The demarcation line that trapped Prague also trapped them. On May 8th, the Russian Liberation Army withdrew westward, hoping to reach American lines and surrender to forces that might treat them as something other than traitors. The demarcation line was closed to them. American commanders had orders not to accept their surrender. They were driven back toward the advancing Soviets. Vlasov was captured on May 12th when Soviet troops surrounded his vehicle near the village of Lnara. His American escort did not intervene. He was taken to Moscow, interrogated, tried in a closed military tribunal, and hanged on August 1st, 1946, along with 11 other senior Russian Liberation Army officers, including Bunyachenko. Thousands of their soldiers were executed or sent to the Gulag. Their crime was having helped liberate Prague. During the communist era from 1948 to 1989, the Russian Liberation Army's role in the Prague Uprising was erased from history. Official accounts credited the Red Army exclusively with liberating the city. The Russian soldiers who had actually saved the uprising were written out of the story, their graves unmarked, their sacrifice forbidden to be discussed. Only after 1989 did Czech historians begin reassessing what had actually happened. On April 30th, 2020, Prague erected a monument to the Russian Liberation Army in the Reporia district. Russia's foreign ministry condemned it as a blasphemous mockery of memory. The monument stands anyway, a belated acknowledgement of men who died for a city that was forbidden to remember them. Patton's fury at being halted at Pilsen was volcanic and unrestrained. His diary entry from May 6, 1945, captures his frustration in language that still burns off the page. General Bradley called up to state the halt line through Pilsen is mandatory. This is due to the fact that General Eisenhower does not wish at this late date to have any international complications. It seems to me that as great a nation as America should let the other people worry about the complications. Personally, I would go to the line of the Moldau River and tell the Russians that is where I intended to stop. Patton told his staff that they would probably never get the chance to do something like this again. He was right. The opportunity to liberate Prague, to shape the post-war future of Central Europe, passed in those hours and would never return. His later reflection was even more bitter. I felt and still feel that we should have gone on to the Moldau River, and if the Russians did not like it, let them go to hell. On May 18th, Patton wrote in his diary a passage that reads like prophecy. The American army, as it now exists, could beat the Russians with the greatest of ease, because while the Russians have good infantry, they are lacking in artillery, air, tanks, and in the knowledge of the use of the combined arms. If we do give them time to build up supplies, then we have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them. But we have failed in the liberation of Europe. We have lost the war. Churchill shared Patton's strategic vision, though he expressed it more diplomatically. The British Prime Minister had been warning about Soviet intentions for months. After the Prague crisis resolved in Soviet favour, his warnings grew more urgent. On May 12th, just 3 days after Soviet tanks rolled into Prague, Churchill sent President Truman a telegram containing what may be the first use of a phrase that would define the post-war world. An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front. We do not know what is going on behind. Less than a year later, in March 1946, Churchill delivered his famous address at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. The speech elaborated on that phrase in words that still resonate today. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. Prague did not have to be on that list. American tanks were close enough to reach the city in hours. The road was open. The people were waiting, dying, calling for help on the radio. Prague fell behind the Iron Curtain, not because it was inevitable, but because Eisenhower drew a line and refused to cross it. Soviet tanks entered Prague at dawn on May 9th, 1945. The first was a T-3485, commanded by Guards Lieutenant Ivan Goncharenko of the 63rd Guards Tank Brigade. His tank, bearing tactical marking I-24, reached the suburbs around 4 in the morning and pushed toward the city centre. Goncharenko was killed by shrapnel near Manez Bridge that same morning, one of approximately 30 Soviet soldiers who died in Prague itself. A street in Prague still bears his name. The Red Army was greeted as liberators by exhausted Czechs, who had fought for 4 days without outside help. But the heaviest fighting was already over. Czech insurgents and Russian Liberation Army soldiers had held the city against German counterattacks. They had paid the price in blood. Czech casualties numbered somewhere between 1,700 and 2,900 killed, with another 3,000 wounded. Soviet casualties in Prague itself were minimal, a reflection of how late they arrived and how little actual fighting they did. The Soviets claimed full credit anyway. In the official history of the Prague Uprising, the Red Army liberated the city from Nazi occupation. The Czech resistance fought bravely but required Soviet rescue. The Russian Liberation Army did not exist. This version of history was enforced for 40 years. The contrast between Pilsen and Prague haunts Czech memory to this day. In Pilsen, Americans were greeted with the kind of jubilation that soldiers dream about: chocolate and chewing gum distributed to children, dancing in the streets, friendships formed between liberators and liberated. American troops remained until early December 1945, and when they left behind gratitude, that endured through decades of communist rule. Pilsen residents hid American flags during the communist era. They taught their children the truth about who had liberated their city. They maintained secret connections with American veterans who had served there. When communism fell, Pilsen exploded in celebration of the liberation it had never forgotten. Today, Pilsen hosts an annual Liberation Festival that draws thousands of visitors. The Thank You America Memorial stands in the city centre, inscribed with gratitude in Czech and English. Streets and squares bear the names of American commanders. The city remembers what might have been for all of Czechoslovakia. Prague got something different. Soviet liberation gave the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia a powerful propaganda weapon. The Red Army had saved Prague from the Nazis. This narrative, repeated endlessly through communist-controlled media, helped persuade many Czechs that it made sense to rely mainly on Moscow. The path from liberation to totalitarian rule was not immediate, but it was inexorable. In the free elections of May 1946, the Communist Party won 38% of the vote, a plurality that made Klement Gottwald Prime Minister. This was a genuine election, the last Czechoslovakia would see for 40 years. The Communists won because they were well organized, because Soviet prestige was high, and because many Czechs genuinely believed that socialism offered a better future. But communist popularity was declining by 1947. The party expected to lose the elections scheduled for May 1948. Stalin could not permit a communist government to be voted out of office. It would set a dangerous precedent for the rest of Eastern Europe. He ordered Gottwald to seize power before the elections could be held. In February 1948, the coup unfolded with brutal efficiency. 12 non-communist ministers resigned from the government, hoping to trigger a political crisis that would lead to new elections. Instead, communist-controlled police and armed workers' militias deployed throughout Prague. Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Valerian Zorin arrived to oversee events and signal Moscow's support. President Edvard Beneš faced an impossible choice. He could refuse to accept the resignations and face civil war, possibly Soviet intervention, or he could capitulate and watch his democracy die. Beneš was 63 years old, exhausted and broken by decades of struggle. He had led Czechoslovakia through the Munich betrayal, through exile, through the hope of liberation, only to see freedom slip away again. On February 25th, 1948, Beneš capitulated. He accepted an all-communist government. The last democracy in Central Europe died without a shot being fired. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, son of the founder of Czechoslovakia, was found dead beneath his office window at the Chernin Palace on March 10, 1948. His death was ruled a suicide. Almost no one believed it. Masaryk had been a symbol of democratic Czechoslovakia, a bridge between East and West. His murder, for that is almost certainly what it was, marked the final consolidation of communist power. 41 years of totalitarian rule followed. When Alexander Dubček attempted to create socialism with a human face during the Prague Spring of 1968, the response came with overwhelming force. On August 20th and 21st, Soviet, Polish, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops invaded Czechoslovakia in the largest military operation in Europe since World War II. East German forces were ordered to remain at the border at the last moment. Soviet leadership, fearing that German troops would provoke greater resistance given memories of Nazi occupation. Tanks rolled through the same streets where Czechs had built barricades in 1945. The invasion came without warning in the middle of the night. Transport aircraft landed at Prague airport, disgorging paratroopers who seized key positions before most Czechs knew what was happening. By dawn, Prague was occupied. The people resisted with the same spirit they had shown in 1945, but without weapons. They surrounded Soviet tanks and argued with confused conscripts who had been told they were preventing a Western invasion. They painted over street signs to disorient the occupiers. They broadcast from underground radio stations, maintaining communication even as Soviet forces hunted them. 137 Czech civilians died in the invasion. Dubček was arrested, taken to Moscow, forced to sign documents repudiating his reforms, then returned to Prague to announce the end of everything he had tried to build. He was eventually expelled from the Communist Party and assigned to work as an inspector in the forestry administration in Bratislava, erased from public life for 20 years. On January 16, 1969, a 20-year-old student named Jan Palach walked to the top of Wenceslas Square in Prague, doused himself with gasoline, and set himself ablaze. He died 3 days later from burns covering 85% of his body. His self-immolation was a protest against the Soviet occupation and against Czech passivity in the face of oppression. Palach's funeral on January 25th drew tens of thousands of mourners. It was the largest public gathering in Prague since the invasion. The communist authorities watched nervously but did not intervene. The crushing of the Prague Spring was followed by 20 years of what the regime called normalization. Dissent was suppressed. Intellectuals were silenced. The country turned inward. Its people focused on private life because public life offered only conformity or punishment. The Velvet Revolution of November 1989 finally ended communist rule. Protesters filled Wenceslas Square, jangling their keys in a gesture of farewell to the regime. The communist government collapsed with stunning speed, unable to maintain power once it became clear that Soviet tanks would not come to rescue it. Václav Havel, the dissident playwright who had been imprisoned repeatedly for his writings, was elected president on December 29, 1989. He was the first non-communist leader of Czechoslovakia since the coup 41 years earlier. The last Soviet troops withdrew from Czechoslovakia in June 1991. General Eduard Vorobyov departed on June 27th, ending a military presence that had begun on May 9th, 1945. 73,500 Soviet soldiers and 39,000 family members and civilian employees left the country. They left behind environmental devastation, contaminated water supplies, and a nation that had lost 2 generations to unfreedom. From Soviet arrival in Prague to the departure of the last Soviet soldier, 46 years had passed. This was the cost of a line drawn on a map, of a request politely granted, of a decision not to advance those final 50 miles. Historians still debate whether the outcome would have been different if American forces had liberated Prague. Both American and Soviet troops eventually withdrew from Czechoslovakia. There was no permanent occupation plan comparable to the division of Germany. The communist coup occurred 3 years after liberation, driven by domestic political factors as much as by Soviet pressure. Would American liberation have prevented the coup? Would the gratitude felt toward American liberators have translated into political resistance to communism? No one can know for certain. History does not offer control experiments, but we do know that whoever liberates a country shapes its politics, at least in the crucial early years. We do know that Soviet liberation gave Czech communists a propaganda advantage they exploited ruthlessly. Czech historian Vít Smetana summarized the tragedy in words that deserve to be remembered. If the American generals had been just a little more resolute in May 1945, 2 generations of Czechs and Slovaks could have lived in a free world rather than a Soviet satellite. Eisenhower never expressed regret about the decision. he defended similar choices throughout his life, arguing that military commanders should not make political decisions without explicit authorization from civilian leadership. When asked about the parallel decision not to race the Soviets to Berlin, he offered a defense that had real moral weight. Berlin was a destroyed city, Eisenhower said. What was the great point in attacking it and capturing it, particularly as our political bosses had already told us that the line we must occupy was 200 miles to the west? He noted that the Soviets used 22 divisions and suffered 10,000 casualties taking the German capital. The argument had moral weight. No commander should spend soldiers' lives casually for objectives of uncertain value. But Prague was not Berlin. Prague could have been taken with minimal casualties because German resistance had collapsed. The road was open. The enemy was fleeing or surrendering. The men who made the decision to halt at Pilsen were not villains. They were professionals doing their jobs according to the rules they understood. But they failed to see that some decisions transcend military calculations. Some moments demand political vision that military training does not provide. The statue of Marshal Ivan Konev stood in Prague for 30 years during the period known as normalization. It was erected in 1980 to honor the commander whose forces had entered Prague on May 9, 1945. After the Velvet Revolution, it became increasingly controversial. On April 3, 2020, Prague authorities removed it, provoking diplomatic fury from Moscow. The statue is gone now, but the questions it represented remain. Who liberated Prague? The answer depends on how you define liberation. But one fact is beyond dispute. The Americans who could have been there were not. They sat in Pilsen, 50 miles away, listening to the radio, waiting for orders that never came to advance. The lesson of Prague in May 1945 is not that military commanders should ignore civilian authority. The lesson is that some decisions are too important to be made by default, by bureaucratic inertia, by the path of least resistance. When Churchill urged Eisenhower to advance, when Patton begged to be unleashed, they were asking for a political decision. They received a military answer instead. The Czechs paid the price for 44 years. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe. From veterans to history enthusiasts, you are part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.